Welcome everyone to our June 2026 Health Links webinar on belonging for all workers. I am Natalie Schwatka. I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in environmental and occupational health, and I'm also faculty with the Centers for Health Work and Environment, where Health Links formerly lives. Today, we're talking about creating a workplace where every employee feels a genuine sense of well-being and social belonging. And noting that social belonging is a modern organizational imperative. It's fundamental to workforce needs. And while fostering an environment where all team members feel connected and supported is essential for engagement, many organizations continue to struggle with this. They struggle with systematic barriers that lead to isolation and exclusion. So we're happy to be joining with some experts today to talk about this, to explore strategies for dismantling systemic obstacles and nurturing a culture of belonging and inclusivity. Our goal today is to learn how to foster meaningful workplace connections to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Today, some housekeeping before we get going. Everyone is on mute, and if you do have questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A box. The chat feature is great to introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from, and to generally talk with other participants. But if you have a specific question for our panelists, please use the Q&A box. We will have ample time today to go through your questions, so please put them in the Q&A early and often. We do have closed captions, so please use that feature in Zoom if you need it. If you need technical assistance, please use the chat. If you need continuing education credits, there'll be a survey and a follow-up email. And note that this webinar is recorded, so you can come back to it and watch it later. A little bit about us. We are Health Links. It's part of the Centers for Health Work and Environment at the Colorado School of Public Health. We are a public health outreach program that champions health and safety at work, the healthy workplace assessment using the total worker health approach. You can use the QR codes here to scan it with your phone if you want to sign up for our newsletter, either for Health Links or for the Centers for Health Work and Environment. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge our land acknowledgement here, and to note that as we gather here in this Zoom space, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of Indigenous peoples recognize the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to the fields of medicine, mathematics, government and military service, arts, literature, engineering, and more. We also recognize that the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. We recognize and affirm the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands and the many Indigenous people who thrive in this place, alive and strong. We also acknowledge the painful history of ill treatment and forced removal that has profoundly negative impact on Native nations. We respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land, and we honor them and thank the Indigenous ancestors of this place. The University of Colorado pledges to provide educational opportunities for Native students, faculty, and staff, and advance our mission to understand the history and contemporary lives of Native peoples. A little bit of a disclaimer that the views and things and opinions that we talk about today are those of the speakers and don't necessarily reflect the opinions, views, or positions of Health Links, the Centers for Health Work and Environment, or the Colorado School of Public Health. We encourage everyone who's here today to attend to their own self-care needs during and after the presentation and engage with our webinar at a level that is most comfortable for you. So our agenda today, I'm excited to get started. We have 2 great keynote speakers today who will each present for about 5 to 7 minutes each. We'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a lot of time for question and answer. So as you're listening to their presentations, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be able to get to them later. The learning objectives today are first to identify emerging challenges and opportunities for enhancing employee engagement and support in the workplace. 2, to explore practical strategies for developing policies and practices that address systemic barriers. And finally, to learn how to cultivate a culture of belonging and empowerment through sustainable initiatives. With that, I will welcome our first speaker, Dr. Janice Gassama-Sare. She is the founder of BWG Business Solutions, an award-winning DEI consultancy designed to help organizations create cultures built on racial equity. Dr. Janice provides consultations, facilitates workshops, provides guidance, delivers keynote speeches, and awareness talks to spark important dialogue about equity in the workplace. Dr. Janice has had the opportunity to collaborate with Google, Amazon, Yale University, Nordstrom, H&M, and PayPal Venmo, among many others. She is the author of 3 best-selling books: Dirty Diversity, A Practical Guide to Foster an Equitable and Inclusive Workplace for All; The Pink Elephant, A Practical Guide to Creating an Anti-Racist Organization; and Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace. She's a senior contributing writer for Forbes, having authored over 400 articles, a Harvard Business Review contributor, and LinkedIn Learning instructor. In 2022, Dr. Janice was recognized as one of LinkedIn's top voices in racial equity. In 2023, she was recognized by Gusto as one of the top 25 workplace experts to follow. She's a 2-time TEDx speaker, the host of Dirty Diversity podcast, and an adjunct professor at Columbia University. During her free time, Dr. Janice enjoys volunteering as a job coach for the Coalition for the Homeless. Wonderful. Please welcome Dr. Gassama-Sare.
Hi, everyone. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay, perfect. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to have you all here. I see that there's some Knicks people in the chat. I'm a new bandwagon fan. But so I'm going to briefly talk to you today about belonging for workers and what some of the barriers have been to employee belonging, and share a framework with you that I use when I work with organizations and institutions, and something that maybe you'll consider doing within your organizations and institutions. So when we talk about belonging, I think one of the simplest ways to describe belonging is, do you work in a place, or are you in a place where you feel comfortable sharing your concerns, sharing your thoughts, sharing your beliefs, raising your voice whenever you see that something isn't right? That's to me like one of the simplest ways to conceptualize this idea of belonging. And everybody has a different level of belonging that they think about when you envision your workplace, right? Do you feel a sense of belonging? For everybody, that is different, right? And some people will feel varying levels of belonging in the beginning when you start an organization, and then over time that might change. And so it waxes and wanes. But it's important to understand that everyone has a different definition of what belonging means to them. So when we approach this idea of belonging for workers, we have to really think about and understand that there isn't a one size fits all. And what I see with a lot of companies that I work with is that there may be reward systems in place, there may be policies and practices in place, and these practices are really focused on, they're very generic. They don't take into consideration that for everybody, this particular reward or this particular structure may not foster a sense of belonging. So it's important for us all to always remember that it isn't a one size fits all, and that belonging means something different to every single person. I think we can all agree, and I'm sorry if you all hear Peppa Pig. My son has Peppa Pig and he loves to listen to it really loud. So I apologize if you hear the sound of Peppa's voice in the background. But belonging is broken. I think most of us can agree that different events like COVID and like this recession, non-recession thing that we're going through in the US, and that, we saw quiet quitting and now people are job hugging, the sense of belonging and trust that people feel in the workplace is broken. A lot of people, maybe some of you in here, may not necessarily feel like you have that sense of belonging in your current workplace. You may not feel like you can speak up. You may not feel like it's a place, where you belong. I just had a conversation with somebody who's a pharmacist, and she was telling me that her hospital where she's a pharmacist has pictures of all of the pharmacists, and she removed her photo. And I was like, "Why did you remove your photo?" And she was just explaining to me, you know, all of the things that there's a lot of microaggressions that she's experienced in that hospital. She's been there for 10 years now. And she was just saying she doesn't feel like she's part of the team, right? She was a manager and then she stepped down from her role because she felt like she's younger and she felt like they weren't really taking her authority into consideration. They were always undermining what she was doing and what she was saying. And she said, I just want to be a pharmacist. I don't want to have this additional deputy role. So she stepped down. And so I think that's a good example of what many people may feel in one way or another within their workplaces where you may have been undermined. You may have contributed ideas that you feel are not being listened to. And so everybody has a different, again, varying level of what belonging means to them. But I think across workplaces, what I've seen is that belonging and that level of trust is broken. I think people are really scared with the mass layoffs, whether their job is secure, and all of those factors impact belonging and the level of trust that employees feel in the workplace. So, thinking about and taking these things into consideration, it's also important to consider things that are happening in the wider global and national scale. We see a lot of laws that have changed since Trump got reelected. We see that the conflict or war with Iran is also impacting prices and impacting people's mood, is impacting a lot. We see what's happening with the Supreme Court, again, and the different laws that are shifting. And then if you've been keeping up, the media landscape in the US is changing. So the major media conglomerates that, people might get their news from CBS, or they may use TikTok, or they may use Meta, and how these social media and these media platforms are shaping our perceptions and are impacting us in the way that we engage with people. All of these things impact the level of belonging that people feel when they come into the workplace, right? If they feel like they're being surveilled, for example, by their social media, it could impact how they show up in the workplace, right? If your workplace is using any of these types of media, you may feel that, a deeper sense of surveillance. You may feel like your company, your leadership doesn't trust you, and all of that impacts the sense of belonging that you feel. So it's important to take into consideration what is happening, because nothing happens in a vacuum. And employees, you may not have an environment where people feel comfortable discussing like what is happening, how they feel about certain things. But it is impacting them. It's happening behind the scenes, right? And so I think that when we think about things like worker health and well-being, we have to consider what is happening at a wider scale and the different ways that these national and global events may be impacting employees. So, taking all of that into consideration, what can we do? I think that's an important question to ask ourselves, especially in our workplaces. And so, I created a framework called the Employee Difference Compass because it acknowledges that all of us come to the workplace with differences, right? Every single employee. I think that since 2020, when the DEI was really the focus and DEI really blew up, more people were talking about things like race. But I think that with the anti DEI sentiment, it's important for people to remember, especially if you work in a company where they've gotten rid of or dismantled your DEI programs and your DEI structures, that the need for DEI will always be there because DEI is essentially, like, the simplest way I describe it is a way to manage employee differences. Everybody's coming into the workplace with different perspectives, with different experiences, with different levels of, education. And how does that come together in like an employee cocktail and impact people? Because you're working on a team, and how do you navigate employee conflict and differences? And so it's really important to understand and acknowledge that we're all coming to the workplace with differences, right? Different perspectives, different experiences, and these impact the levels of belonging that we feel, and how we show up in the workplace, whether we feel comfortable opening up. If I'm somebody that worked in a company for 20 years and they fired me without so much as like acknowledging all that I've put in, when I show up to a new company, I might be more closed off and more hesitant to open up to my coworkers, right? And might meet somebody and they might say, Janice is really standoffish, when in actuality, it's like I haven't really healed from the past workplace trauma that I went through. So, acknowledging employee differences is an important part of the framework when we talk about rebuilding belonging. And then looking at, who is most impacted by different policies and practices and systems and structures, who requires the most support is an important question to ask ourselves, right? If you are on a team and someone is neurodivergent and they share with you, for example, that they have autism, and the way that they communicate, they may require different communication than some of the other team members. So looking at who is most impacted and recognizing that each employee has a different level of impact and support that they require. And then an important piece after you recognize that is developing interventions, right? Differences will always be there. Employees will always require different things. You might have an employee who needs a quiet space to pump because they just had a baby. You might have an employee who needs a quiet room to pray. You might have an employee that needs time off because of an event that's happening that's impacting people of their particular culture or race. And so thinking about what interventions look like in your workplace to address belonging is important. And I think we're in a really critical moment because a lot of these interventions have been dismantled, because there's this perception that employee differences don't matter and it's only race, for example, or only gender or only people of particular backgrounds that are impacted. But all of us are impacted when these systems get removed. And so thinking about ways to develop interventions that are consistent and long term is so important. And then I think the most important piece of this whole framework is minimizing resistance. Every workplace that I've done any sort of equity work, what I've noticed, and maybe what you've noticed in your workplace, is there's always resistance. There's resistance from people who don't believe in the work. There's resistance from people who think that if you're integrating systems of belonging, it's only going to benefit certain groups of people. There is always going to be a level of resistance. Maybe some people just don't care because they feel like, okay, this doesn't affect me one way or another. And so you have to recognize what the source of the resistance is and then integrate strategies to minimize that resistance. Because if you're able to minimize the resistance, you're able to increase the effectiveness of the different types of belonging systems that you integrate, right? But if every employee is doubtful and is skeptical of the systems that you're integrating, it's not, the likelihood of success is going to be low. So when you're thinking about belonging, within your workplace, understanding what employee differences are is an important part of the framework. And then looking at who's most impacted, who requires the most support, and then asking yourself and asking those most impacted, what support systems do you require? What does support look like for you? And then integrating strategies to minimize that resistance. That could be, those strategies could be educating people on how this particular policy or how this particular belonging system is going to benefit other people, right? Because there may be a perception that this is only going to benefit this person, right? Maybe a group of women came together within an organization and said, we're not getting paid equitably. We want to do some sort of, we want pay transparency and we want a pay evaluation. And you might think, well, I don't care. I know I'm getting paid fairly. But in actuality, when you do a pay equity audit or a pay audit, you might find out that you're getting paid less than what you actually should be. And so that's a specific intervention that may be something that was only specifically for those women employees to address possible pay disparities, but in actuality, it's going to benefit everyone. So you have to really think about what the source of the resistance is and then developing strategies to minimize that resistance. So I go into that more in a lot of the work that I do in the writing, but that's just kind of like a brief overview. But after you leave this session today, I think the first step of kind of like how do you apply what we've talked about is looking at like the first thing is which is understanding employee differences. What are the ways that employees are different within our organizations, right? What are the different backgrounds and perspectives and ideas that are being brought into this team or into this workplace? That's the first key. And then understanding, right, who is most impacted, who requires the most support, and then developing interventions to address the support that is required from employees, and then integrating strategies to minimize the resistance. That could be educating people on the benefit of a particular policy and helping people to understand how this isn't something that just benefits one person, but it can benefit all of us. So that is where I will leave off. I will stop my share. And thank you all for listening. And I hope that you found that super quick sort of overview helpful in some way.
That was wonderful, Janice. Thank you. I look forward to talking with you more during our Q&A session. Okay, well, let's get our next keynote speaker, Bernie Wong, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. And just a reminder, please post your questions in the question feature here on Zoom, and we'll be sure to get to those when we're done with our keynote. So with that, I will welcome Bernie Wong. He is a mental health educator, a public health practitioner, and a systems thinker who has spent over a decade working to improve the mental health and well-being of all. Most recently, Bernie was on the founding team for Mindshare Partners, a nonprofit at the forefront of the workforce mental health movement. There, he built and scaled the organization's client services infrastructure to over 500 trainings in 150 organizations, including PGIM, Hyatt, and Ollie. Bernie's work spans national polls cited by the CDC, Economist, a virtual community of 600 ERG leaders, and high visibility brand partnerships with Eldman, Pureleaf, iStock, and Qualtrics. Bernie has written for publications like Harvard Business Review and Forbes, and spoken at events hosted by NIOSH, Lenovo, Saramount, and the Collective Impact Forum. Prior to Mindshare, Bernie worked in human-centered design at the Social Innovation Lab, Hope Lab, in education through the Stanford Continuing Education Studies, and in editorial writing at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. Bernie currently sits on the board of directors for the Prison Foundation, a grassroots philanthropy that funds students and organizations working to empower the LGBTQIA+ and Asian and Pacific Islander communities. Bernie holds a Master's of Health Science from Johns Hopkins Bloomfield School of Public Health and a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology. He's currently pursuing a Doctor of Public Health and Leadership Advocacy and Equity at Tulane School of Public Health. Welcome, Bernie.
All right, thank you. I was like, do I turn my camera on during this second? All right, let me just get oriented and share my screen. And let's see.
Looks great.
All right, I'm gonna try this to put myself here. I only found out this functionality, so hopefully I don't get in the way of my own presentation. I might change it, but great. So hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining our session today. For my segment on belonging, I'd like to explore this idea of lonely systems. Some might argue we're kind of biologically wired for connection. We naturally want to connect and belong, including at work. But as many of you know already, there's been an upswell of conversation recently around the loneliness crisis, in part catalyzed by the former U.S. Surgeon General's advisory in 2023. Many of the calls to action we're seeing focus on, promoting connection and belonging, including in the advisory, but my thesis is that it's not quite that simple. Today, our culture and systems of work itself are often built and not always intentionally in ways that create disconnection, and it's through this lens of work systems that I'd like to focus on for the next 7 to 8 minutes. So to level set, what do I even mean by work systems? At its core, what we're really talking about is looking at the many different interconnected parts of a workplace and how they produce specific outcomes, whether it's business outcomes or belonging. I already see myself blocking some of my text, so I'm going to change it back to this. But when we're thinking about a workplace system in the context of belonging, we're not only talking about, well-being programs or the all-team retreats or the coffee chats we do with colleagues, but also its policies, its compensation structure, the business model, and how work itself gets done. So to make this idea a bit more concrete, because systems thinking is quite and very expansive, let's take employee mental health as one example, since this is the space that I've worked in for the past decade. So several years ago, Amazon installed mindfulness booths for their warehouse workers, which in some spheres you'd say, yes, mindfulness and meditation is heavily researched, it's evidence-based, it's proven to reduce stress and burnout in the academic literature. It's also arguably tailored to this population. It can get loud and hectic on the warehouse floor. This could be a welcome retreat from the chaos. Fantastic. Now, the challenge was how this kind of quote unquote intervention or program holds up through this kind of systems lens. It later came to light that Amazon warehouse workers were under such high productivity expectations that they didn't even have time to go to the restroom during their assigned breaks. Rates of injury for Amazon warehouse workers were also higher than the industry average due to this high pressure culture. So following the installation of these booths, warehouse workers ended up calling them cry closets because you just go in and cry due to the pressures of the work environment. Now, this example is not intended to specifically name and shame Amazon, but this is just one example of a likely kind of robust, tailored, evidence-based intervention that didn't necessarily align with the broader realities of the work system. So pivoting back to belonging as we look to the changing landscape of work today, we're finding several work trends that are influencing belonging, unfortunately, often for the worse. This includes employee surveillance, which Janice actually mentioned, so great continuation, the implementation of generative AI, and the pushback against DEI/BJ. So for employee surveillance, it's a pretty literal and obvious change in work systems in terms of how monitoring technologies are implemented into workplaces, whether it be physical cameras or digital softwares, or even the many different ways productivity is tracked and monitored. And we've seen evidence around how surveillance is associated with experiences of stress and anxiety and depression alongside a reduction in a sense of personal agency. There's also research showing that workers begin to survey each other in cultures of high surveillance, and the overall experience ultimately results in this sense of diminished trust and belonging, not only between workers, but between workers and the organization. With generative AI, of course, recognizing much of this research is very emergent and that there certainly are advantages and use cases to AI, but early studies have documented that one outcome when workplaces implement AI, and specifically generative AI, is that workers end up interacting and relying less on one another because they're using this platform to either do their work or bounce ideas off of. And this use of AI is associated with increases in subjective loneliness. With AI's role too in workers' fear of job security, this similarly impacts workers' sense of trust and belonging with their organization, depending on kind of how they roll out the use of AI. And third, we've seen recent pushbacks against diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And again, much like AI, the evidence is emergent given that this particular groundswell of momentum emerged relatively recently, but we can certainly anticipate risks in how these rollbacks can impact the systems we've set in place to protect against harm, including discrimination and harassment. And from that, we can also see how this might influence the historically positive associations of successful and impactful DEI efforts in creating a vibrant and rich culture of fairness and belonging. So this lens of work systems is important because work itself is becoming less conducive to belonging. And by only focusing on what we may traditionally consider belonging programs at work, we miss this crucial foundation of belonging at work, which is this work piece. Additional trends we're seeing include the rise in the frequency of layoffs as a business strategy. I think Glassdoor late last year called this era of forever layoffs. We're seeing companies have a varied approach to hybrid and remote work. There's also been quite a long, kind of rich history of documented rise of gig work and researchers call precarious employment. So all of this, all of these individual trends cumulatively disproportionately impact populations that have historically faced extra barriers to stable employment and who have benefited from many of the work systems that have been created to be more inclusive and be more flexible. So going back to belonging, we can't really build a true sense of belonging when workers are too busy working, when they can lose their jobs at any given moment in time, and when they can't really truly trust the entities that they dedicate 40 hours a week to at the very least. But it's not all doom and gloom. While we've seen investments in things like belonging, flexible work, and mental health waiver from year to year, what I've seen more steady is this fundamental shift in workers' awareness and understanding around belonging at work and what it means to truly invest in belonging beyond the frills of a monthly awareness month or a team icebreaker. And this broader cultural shift in values is here to stay no matter the labor market. So to leave you all with a final hopeful message, understanding we have limited time, we fortunately have the tools to achieve this. Many of the strategies to create healthier work systems are well documented, whether it be frameworks like Quality Jobs by Jobs of the Future or Total Worker Health. I've included links to these resources in my link tree for convenience. But at the end of the day, outcomes like belonging, well-being, and workers' livelihoods often anchor on similar fundamental principles. And hopefully, today's segment equips you with a perspective to really name a connection between work and belonging that we've always known or at least felt intuitively. All right, thanks for your time. I tried to keep it super brief, but look forward to our Q&A segment.
Wonderful, Bernie. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciated both of your perspectives, Janice and Bernie, on the need for social connection in the workplace in a way that reflects, you feeling being respected and that you belong there. You're cared for as who you are as a person, your background, your perspectives, and things like that. Even when what's going on in the outside world, globally or within your community, is really stressful. And I liked how you were grounding your perspectives in employee needs and a flexible focus on who may need the most support at a certain time. So I found that particularly interesting, Janice. And Bernie, I loved your systems focus to really think about, do employees have the best chance to engage in practices that help them feel like they belong and that they're cared for? And I definitely appreciated your forward-thinking focus, and I have questions about that. So again, everyone who's participating, please put your questions in the chat for Janice and Bernie, and we'll get to them. We have a few questions to get us started. I think the first one I have is, on a day-to-day basis, what does belonging look like? What might you hear? What might you see? What are some small behaviors or habits that people can sense? Like, I belong here. Like, I think I matter. Who wants to take that first? Like day to day,
I can,
maybe Jen.
I can take it and then I'm Bernie. I think, people feeling like I don't know if anyone is ever excited to go to work. Maybe people are excited to do the work that they do, but I would say the feeling of being excited maybe about an aspect of work, maybe seeing your team members, right? Because belonging, I think a large part of belonging is also you enjoy the people that you work with. So you might not necessarily always agree with leadership. You might not agree with some of the policies and practices. You might not like the level of work, but you enjoy the people that you work with, you enjoy your team members. So I think that that's a huge part of it because a lot of what I hear when I speak with employees, when it comes to a disconnect with belonging, is something related to either another employee, a manager, or somebody on their team, right? I don't think it's ever like belonging is tied to these hygiene factors like maybe money, right? Money's not going to impact your sense of belonging. Money might make you consider looking for a new job, but will it make you actually go get a new job? No, but the toxic manager that you work with will. And so I think that the team and the people that you work with play a really big factor. And if you're excited about seeing them and being around them and talking to them, I think that that could be a huge indicator of belonging. And I think dreading seeing the people that you work with, even if you do love the work and all of these other factors, could indicate that the belonging just isn't there.
Mhm. I like that. Excited to go to work. That's a good like gut check, especially for individuals. Yeah. What do you think, Bernie?
Yeah, maybe to add a few additional details, I'd say belonging in practice by and large can and almost should look like any number of things because the premise is hopefully kind of a rich and vibrant workplace with a lot of diverse experiences, perspective, and needs. So while I'd say there's certainly best practices you can follow in kind of fostering belonging, you're also hopefully tailoring your actions and programs and initiatives to the unique needs of your workforce. So I'd say then the one thing that belonging will always look like in practice is listening followed by action. I think sometimes we may often seek to find what those best practices are or look at what other companies are doing, and sometimes we miss that your own kind of workforce has its own unique culture and needs. And so, fundamental as the one universal kind of truth to fostering belonging are ways that the organization listens. It could be as simple as, you know, a manager, when a new employee or direct report joins a team, they're like, how do you prefer to work? Like, what do you enjoy doing? How do I support and know you as a human being, up to more, organizational systems like the engagement surveys. But sometimes, again, we follow the program we see and do the things that we see other companies doing while missing the ultimate goal is to understand your people. And if it's not kind of mechanistically kind of creating a more illustrative picture of your own workforce, then it's not kind of doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Mhm. Totally. I love that. Listen and act. Yeah, totally. I think that feeds into the next question I had, and like, a few people have questions about this in the Q&A around leadership. And so definitely something I'm personally interested. I'm curious at a high level, what can leaders do to create environments where people feel like they belong and they matter, especially when maybe you have a really diverse team. Um, and just to note the Q&A in the chat, people have been saying it's leadership's role and responsibility to regulate the space, not just the behavior. And then there was also a question about how, leaders can build that trust needed to foster a sense of belonging. So broadly, what would your top tips be for managers to help facilitate belonging and connection?
I would definitely say asking employees. It sounds really simple, but I've been working with companies who either don't ask and they assume that they know what employees want, or when they do ask, they don't actually integrate what it is that employees say that they want. So I've done work with employee resource groups, and one in particular, they have these executive meetings. So some members of the employee resource group will meet with the leaders of the company and they'll talk about their needs. And it's a way for executives to make the employees feel heard. But one main complaint was like they don't do anything with the feedback we provide them with. It's like you're talking to a wall. You say all of these things, and then next week the same issues still pop up. So it feels like very cosmetic, like they're doing it just for surface level. So I think asking employees what it is, and I saw a question about disabilities, how to foster belonging. And that was going to be my answer that I was going to write, where I was going to say, you really have to ask employees, and it's difficult when someone has an invisible disability, right? Because people don't want to disclose, there's issues with disclosure. But I would say generally, if there's ways to ask employees what their specific needs are, um, and if they feel comfortable disclosing, they can. And then really trying to figure out how can we actually integrate what they need, right? Not just asking them, but how do we, because employees hold the key and they'll tell you this is what we need to feel supported. I just don't think enough leaders listen or they integrate what employees suggest.
Mhm. Yeah, that's helpful. What do you think, Bernie? What should leaders do?
Yeah, I'd say this is almost something I can't tell leaders to do, but I often notice a big difference is when leaders are leaning into things like belonging to solve a problem versus this is something that's truly stemming from something they care about. Because it's I think what Janice and many others I'm sure will say is a lot of the investment in things like belonging and DEIBJ are things you do proactively because when issues emerge later, it's much more of a bigger project to kind of disentangle the culture and the systems that have created this thing that you're now just noticing. But going back, I'm going to take a leap to presume positive intent from leaders. And so maybe one simple action is to just very explicitly state your intent to want people to feel like they belong and matter. At Mindshare, I've often had people ask me, kind of managers, they're like, oh, I want my direct report or my colleague to feel connected. I want them to feel heard or feel supported, but I'm not really sure how. And part of my guidance is to just quite literally tell them. So say to people that I want you to belong here. I care about the perspective you bring. I want you to feel like you belong. And I want to create an experience here that facilitates that. Now, that said, going back to my point of listen then act, I'd say you have to be ready to follow through with some kind of action because, as many of us know, intent doesn't always translate to impact, but it's necessary, particularly for leaders in the way that most organizations are built in a way where leaders are stewarding kind of resources and systems. I actually think I saw a question around what can employees do is challenging because organizations aren't necessarily set up to fully empower employees to feel and create belonging because of just the innate nature of hierarchy. So I'd say leaders' role is to create the box and to create almost, I say, an incentive structure because in a time of efficiency and busyness, people are making choices in the split second, and leaders' roles are to create environments that incentivize certain behaviors, whether it's putting belonging off to the side or taking a moment to prioritize it.
Mhm. And I think a follow-up question someone had in here was about how can a leader do this in a space where their own system is operating against people, like, operating in a maybe an organization that where belonging isn't a priority, but the leader themselves, the middle manager, wants to make it a priority. What can they do in that situation to support their team?
That's a tough one. I think there has to be conversations about the ways that the systems aren't set up to support employee belonging. I think, like Bernie mentioned, just it's difficult for employees to foster belonging because the inherent nature of companies is just every company is hierarchical in some way. But I think that there has to be a conversation. And middle managers have a difficult role because it's like they may be trying to integrate change, but they have some power, but may not have all of the power. But I do think finding if there are any other leaders that are advocates or supportive of particular changes, collaborating with them, and finding others who may have some levels of power, who may be also interested in seeing some of these changes being implemented. So I think finding those change champions, and maybe if the middle manager is the only one, being able to find being able to have that conversation with other executives because it may be something that other leaders didn't realize, right? Or it just wasn't in their purview or something that hasn't been brought to their attention. Or they could know and they just don't care and they're just kind of like, we have bigger fish to fry, as they say. But I think it kind of depends on a few different factors. But I would definitely say if there are other leaders that are also wanting to see shifts and changes happening, seeing if you can collaborate with them to spark a wider conversation within the organization.
Mhm.
I like that you bring up middle managers because that's a whole population and workforce we have to figure out because most often in Mindshare's client work, leaders would want to kind of equip their managers to support their employees better. But we also read about how organizations are cutting out middle managers and how nobody wants to be a middle manager anymore. So that in of itself is already a pressure cooker. But I'd say, and hopefully somewhat answering a couple of questions I see, if you're within a broader system that isn't necessarily supportive or invested in DEI or belonging, I'd say A, there's a lot of things that you can do that's within a manager's purview because managers do in the hierarchy of power can control things like schedule or when deliverables are done, or maybe they can define the what and the when, but they can offer flexibility on the how. So understanding what is my unique role as a manager, where as leaders, they almost create the box, but maybe as managers, you can steward some shifts and flexibility within. And I'd also say, going back to kind of one of my last points in my presentation, things like belonging, employee well-being, DEIB Day, a lot of these things anchor on kind of core human support. So whether you call it DEIB Day or call it employee well-being, if you look at all those frameworks and more, you'll notice that there are commonalities around fostering human connection or flexibility or agency because there is some level of universality around human needs. And so I'm on the fence of whether we continue with a flag of calling it DIBJ, while maybe there are environments where we need to call it something else to continue the work. I'm still very much kind of mixed on what's the quote unquote best thing to do, but there are certainly ways you can continue the work forward by anchoring on, those fundamental core human principles that are named in Total Worker Health and a lot of other frameworks.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think both of you have talked a lot about the systems approach to what can management, what can the organization do to create belonging. But there's been a few questions in here, and Bernie, you've kind of touched on it a little bit. Like, what can the individual person do to increase their sense of belonging? And what does the middle manager do when they don't feel like they belong? So what can the individual do in a situation where they don't feel like they belong? What are some strategies?
I think we've all been in that situation. I know I have been in that situation. And I had to weigh my options and say, is this an environment I want to stay in? But this was years ago before the precarious financial status or state of the country. So I wouldn't advise anybody to like leave their jobs. I think things are tough. And so holding on or job hugging, as they say, is a good idea. But I think there are a couple things you have to ask yourself. Is this something that I want to make a case for within my company? Do I have the energy? Because you could rally other employees around who may feel the same way as you and see if you can try to have conversations with leaders and if there's ways to try to drive change. But if you have the energy, that does take a lot of energy. That's not something you're getting compensated for, and it's something outside of your job. And you may not be successful. You may rally employees together, have conversations with leaders, and things still don't change. So I think that I know that there's a psychological theory where if employees aren't having their needs met at work, they do things within their role to try to, it could be if you go into the office, you might steal some staplers or get your things printed from home that are not necessarily work related because you feel like you don't feel that sense of justice within your organization. So you're trying to find a way to level the playing field. So it isn't a good thing, but I think that you have to either decide that you want to speak up and rally people together, but that might not actually create change, or I think ways to foster belonging amongst yourself. So if it's a manager or somebody that you work directly with, if there are ways to not engage with them, or if there's ways to avoid contact or engagement with them, that's something as an individual you could do. Right, but like Bernie mentioned earlier, I think it's hard because employees don't have a lot of power to really change systems within organizations. So there may be things individually that you do. You could have a conversation. I don't always recommend this, but you could have a conversation with others, with leadership. But again, I think that this may not actually create transformation. So you have to do like a cost benefit analysis and ask yourself, is this an environment I'm willing to stay in? And for most people, that's going to be yes. You can't afford to leave for whatever reason. And so you have to kind of do what you have to do to survive within that environment. Maybe it's finding a distraction, finding people and things that you do enjoy at the company that do foster that. Maybe you have a coworker you don't see often that brings you joy. And so maybe finding ways to collaborate more with that person to kind of offset what you're feeling at within the organization. But yeah, just I would not advise anybody. I think in an ideal world, yeah, you could quit, but it's just not realistic for most people.
Mhm. Sure.
Yeah, I think similar. My very unhelpful answer is it depends on your circumstances, and which is why so many of Janice's and my talking points are to leaders and about systems, because truly that's in the way that organizations are set up. That's the power structure that we're trying to nudge to create the freedom for individuals to then self-pursue what works best for them. But for the individual, I'd say just like, I think if you're trying to create change, do what you can to notice where there's less resistance and potentially use that as you're in. So whether maybe they're not quite along the justice end of the DIBJ spectrum, but they have ERGs in place, and that being a starting place, and then almost further nudging, we're at this end of the spectrum. There's less resistance here. How do I create momentum in this space and then slowly build elsewhere? I think also recognizing there's also a diversity of buy-in, I'm sure, among leaders, and there's been a lot of success when you kind of find that champion. They don't always, they're not always a champion of, for example, DEIBJ or mental health, but you can kind of tell when people are naturally drawn to a certain leader because they care or because they kind of understand those basic and fundamental principles around supporting people. And sometimes those champions can help kind of steward the politics and bureaucracy of actually getting a program up in place.
Mhm. Yeah, I like the idea of scaffolding and thinking about what you can build on of what's already going on. Um, there is one question that I feel like we've danced around a little bit, and I'm curious if you have other thoughts. So this person is a third-party consultant, and they're curious how they can clearly and effectively speak to the importance of culture and belonging to a leadership team that is resistant to seeing their workforce as something more than a number. What are some effective talking points they could use with leadership in this case?
Unfortunately, I always go back to when it comes to resistance, what do you stand to lose by staying the same? And a lot of leaders, especially right now with the climate, don't feel like it's worth it to invest, to continue to invest in DEI. But what do you stand to lose when you don't? And there's still lawsuits taking place. There's still, Google recently was sued for racial discrimination a few months ago, and they lost and they had to pay millions of dollars out. So, when you fail to create an environment where people do feel a sense of belonging, there are legal ramifications and legal consequences. And so I think not just that, but if you're a smaller company, reputational damage is a huge thing. Google is not going to be impacted by reputational damage, but a smaller company that people are not familiar with will be. And so I think I hate the making the business case for diversity language, but sometimes or oftentimes, companies are not altruistic. They're doing what they're doing. Even nonprofits are doing what they're doing because they want to make money and they want to benefit. And so not focusing on DEI. What are the specific ways? And as a third party consultant, you could probably you have a deeper understanding of the company, right? What are some possible worst case scenarios if there isn't a focus, or with all of the resistance, if things stayed the same, what are some potential things that could happen? And so I think that it's always better, them understanding, leadership understanding, it's always better to take preventative measures versus reactive measures, right? You don't want to be sued. You don't want to be embroiled in a lawsuit. And then when other employees are seeing these things happening, there's research that indicates even if you're not the one that's mistreated in the workplace, seeing a coworker or a colleague get mistreated impacts your desire to stay within the company and impacts the level of trust that you have in the organization. And so I think that really being able to demonstrate this is what, and McKinsey is always coming out with these I think really great, strong studies on why diversity matters. I think their last one was 2023, but they kind of outlined this is how diversity can benefit an organization. And so I think like really outlining by not changing things or by continuing to be resistant, these are the possible things that could happen, may help them to understand why it's important to invest in these programs and also demonstrating how it's when you invest in DEI, it's not just benefiting one person. When you put closed captioning on in a meeting, it's not just helping someone who's hard of hearing, it's helping many other employees. And so I think helping to demonstrate that it's not just one group or one person that will benefit from these policies, but everyone in some way, I think will also be helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a ton more to add. Maybe building off a comment I see from Momoko around at Mindshare, we would often work with execs and kind of understanding where their buy-in to the issue is because there's many ways you can buy in, whether it be through data or the ROI or stories or just because they personally care in some way. And so noticing that and building from there is helpful because there's less you're building off, you're working against less resistance in that sense. But again, there's any number of reasons for the quote unquote business case. But yeah, there's the retention piece, but also even, yeah, the business case, because ultimately the people are growing more diverse and complex and complicated more than ever. And I don't think people and people's lives are going to become increasingly more simple, if you will. So there's the benefit to both stewarding your internal kind of culture and workforce to match the external world that's around you.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think speaking their language matters. And I think someone also retention. I've been doing work with some rural health centers, and they're working on this because it's a retention issue. People aren't going to stick around the town there if they don't feel like they belong. So it's a retention issue for them. So um, really important to speak their language. This was a fabulous conversation, you all. I so appreciate your perspective and the time that you brought. And of course, to all of our participants who had great questions as well, really created a great space for us to learn about belonging and community. So thank you all. Before we sign out, I do want to mention a few things that our next webinar will be on September 16th, focused on the recovery-friendly workplace. Where the recovery-friendly workplace is committed to supporting individuals in recovery from substance use disorder by recognizing recovery as personal and professional strength. So please join us on September 16th. Please sign up to join that webinar after a little bit of a summer break. Thank you all for joining us. You can subscribe to our newsletter by using your phone and scanning that QR code below if you aren't already signed up. Please complete the feedback survey. Stay tuned for a follow-up email on this. Like I said, it's recorded, and so you'll be able to tune in later. And stay engaged, join HealthLinks, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks so much to Janice and Bernie for your time.